The whispers started the moment Josephine Lambert's second husband was lowered into the hard prairie earth, and by sunset every soul in Randsburg, California, knew the widow was cursed. She stood at the graveside in her mourning dress, the black fabric gathering dust from the relentless wind that swept across the Mojave Desert. 24 years old and twice widowed. The mathematics of tragedy were simple enough for anyone to calculate. Her first husband, Thomas, had died in a mining accident just 8 months after their wedding in 1895. Her second, Robert, lasted barely a year before a rattlesnake bite took him in the summer of 1897. Now the good people of Randsburg crossed to the other side of the dusty Main Street when they saw her coming, made signs against evil when she entered the general store, and mothers pulled their sons away as if death itself clung to her skirts. Josephine kept her head high as she walked back to the small house on the edge of town, though her heart felt like lead in her chest. She had loved both men, mourned them properly, and done nothing to deserve the fear and hatred now directed her way. But the human need to find patterns in chaos, to assign blame where there was only misfortune, proved stronger than compassion or reason. 3 months after Robert's funeral, Josephine sat in her kitchen counting the last of her money. The small inheritance from her husbands would not last much longer. She needed work, but no one in Randsburg would hire her. The hotel owner had turned her away. The restaurant refused her application. Even the laundry, desperate for help, closed their door in her face. The curse, they said, might spread. She was contemplating selling the house and leaving California altogether when she heard horses outside. Through the window she saw a stranger dismounting, tall and lean, with dark hair visible beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He tied his horse to her fence post and walked toward her door with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. Josephine opened the door before he could knock. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 27 or 28, with striking gray eyes and several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. Dust covered his clothes, suggesting a long ride. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Matthew Morgan. I'm looking for work and a place to stable my horse. The folks in town said you might have a barn you'd rent out." Josephine blinked in surprise. "They sent you here, to me?" "Well, they mentioned you had space, though they seemed mighty eager to warn me off." His expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested amusement. "I don't put much stock in gossip. You should know what they say about me." Josephine folded her arms across her chest. "I've buried 2 husbands. The town believes I'm cursed, that death follows me. They won't even speak to me anymore." Matthew considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "I've seen a lot of death in my time, madam. Served in the cavalry down in Arizona Territory before mustering out last year. Death goes where it pleases, not where people think it should. Bad luck isn't the same as a curse." His words, spoken so matter-of-factly, brought unexpected tears to Josephine's eyes. She blinked them away quickly. "The barn is out back. It's in decent repair. I can't pay you anything, but you're welcome to use it for your horse in exchange for repairs around the property. The roof needs work and the fence is falling down. That seems more than fair." Matthew extended his hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Lambert." She shook his hand, noting the calluses and the firm but gentle grip. "It's Miss Lambert now, I suppose, or just Josephine?" "Matthew," he replied, "though most folks call me Matt." He moved into the barn that afternoon, making a comfortable space for himself in the loft above where his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper, occupied a stall. Josephine watched from her kitchen window as he worked, efficient and methodical, organizing his few possessions and checking the barn structure. She had not had a conversation longer than a few sentences in months. The loneliness had become so familiar she hardly noticed it anymore, but Matthew's presence reminded her how isolated she had become. The next morning, she woke to the sound of hammering. Matthew was already on her roof, replacing damaged shingles he must have purchased in town. She made coffee and brought it out to him, shading her eyes against the bright September sun. "You didn't have to start so early," she called up. He climbed down the ladder, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Habit from the cavalry. Besides, it gets too hot to work up there once the sun's higher." "I suppose that's true." Josephine hesitated, then added, "The town won't like you helping me. They might turn against you too." "Let them." Matthew took a long drink of coffee. "I've been turned against before. I survived." There was a story there, Josephine sensed, but she did not press. "Instead," she said, "I made extra breakfast if you're hungry." They ate together at her small kitchen table, eggs and biscuits and the last of her bacon. Matthew ate with appreciation, complimenting her cooking in a way that seemed genuine rather than merely polite. He told her about his time in the cavalry, the long patrols through Arizona territory, the harsh beauty of the desert, the friends he had made and lost. He spoke of death without flinching, treating it as a part of life rather than something to fear or avoid. "I mustered out because I was tired of taking orders," he explained. "Wanted to find my own way, maybe start a ranch someday. I've been working my way through California, taking jobs where I can find them, saving money." "What kind of work do you do?" Josephine asked. "Whatever pays." "I've worked cattle drives, hired on as a ranch hand, done some tracking, a bit of everything really." He paused. "I'm good with horses if you know anyone who needs that kind of help. There's a ranch about 10 miles north, the Morrison place. They run cattle and always need hands." Josephine cleared the plates. "Though I should warn you, Mrs. Morrison is one of the worst gossips in the county. She'll have heard about you staying here. I'll take my chances." Matthew stood, carrying his plate to the wash basin despite her protests. "Thank you for breakfast, Josephine." "Best meal I've had in weeks." The way he said her name, simple and respectful, made something warm unfold in her chest. She turned away quickly, focusing on the dishes. "You're welcome." Matthew rode out to the Morrison ranch that afternoon and returned as the sun was setting, looking satisfied. "They hired me on," he reported, finding Josephine in the garden behind the house where she was pulling weeds. "Good pay, and they only need me 4 days a week. That'll give me time to work on your property too." "They didn't mind about you staying here, Mrs." Morrison had plenty to say about it. Matthew's expression was dry. "I told her my living arrangements were my own business. Mr. Morrison seemed to agree, and he's the one who does the hiring." Over the following weeks, Matthew became a fixture around Josephine's property. He repaired the fence, fixed the barn door, replaced more shingles, and tackled a dozen other tasks she had been unable to manage alone. She found herself cooking for two again, enjoying the simple pleasure of sharing meals and conversation. Matthew was easy company, neither too talkative nor too quiet, with a dry sense of humor that sometimes caught her off guard and made her laugh for the first time in months. The town noticed, of course. When Josephine went to the general store, the other customers stopped talking and stared. She heard the whispers as she selected flour and sugar, commentary on the impropriety of a widow living with a strange man, speculation about what this meant for Matthew's future. "That cowboy better watch himself," one woman muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "She'll have him in the ground within a year, mark my words." Josephine's hands shook as she paid for her purchases, but she kept her expression neutral. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. Matthew was waiting outside, leaning against the storefront with his arms crossed. He straightened when he saw her, taking the heavy bag from her hands without a word. They walked to where the horses were tied. "I heard what she said," Matthew told her quietly. "Don't pay it any mind." "How can I not?" Josephine's voice was strained. "They think I'm going to kill you. They think I'm some kind of black widow spreading death wherever I go. They are afraid." Matthew helped her onto her horse before mounting Copper. "People always fear what they don't understand. Bad luck, coincidence, the randomness of tragedy. It's easier to blame you than to accept that terrible things just happen sometimes." They rode in silence for a while, the desert stretching out around them in shades of brown and gold. Finally, Josephine said, "My first husband, Thomas, was a miner. A good man, careful and kind. The accident that killed him also killed 3 other men. No one called their widows cursed. Robert was bitten by a rattlesnake while checking the fence line. It could have happened to anyone. But because it was my husband, because it was the second time, suddenly I'm responsible somehow." "You're not responsible." Matthew's voice was firm. "You're just unlucky, and I'm sorry for your losses." The simple acknowledgement of her grief, without fear or judgment, broke something open inside Josephine. She had not been allowed to mourn properly, not really. The town's suspicion had poisoned everything, turning her sorrow into something shameful. Now, with Matthew's quiet acceptance, she felt permission to finally feel the weight of what she had lost. That evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Josephine found herself talking about Thomas and Robert in a way she had not been able to before. She told Matthew about Thomas's dreams of striking it rich in the mines, his optimism and determination. She spoke of Robert's gentle nature, his love of music, the way he would sing while working in the garden. Matthew listened without interruption, his presence steady and grounding. When she finished, he said, "They sound like they were good men. You deserved more time with them." "Yes," Josephine whispered. "I did." The weeks turned into months. October brought cooler temperatures and occasional rain that turned the desert briefly green. Matthew continued working at the Morrison Ranch while maintaining Josephine's property. Their friendship deepened into something comfortable and familiar, a partnership of sorts. She handled the cooking and the house, while he managed the heavier labor. They ate together, talked together, and sometimes sat in companionable silence on the porch in the evenings. Josephine found herself noticing things about Matthew she had tried to ignore at first. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the capable strength in his hands as he worked, the thoughtfulness behind his words, the intelligence in his observations. She was 24 and had been married twice, but she had never felt quite like this before. Her marriages had been born of practicality and affection, suitable matches that grew into genuine care. What she felt stirring for Matthew was different, deeper somehow, and it terrified her. She could not risk it. Could not risk caring for another man who might be taken from her. Could not risk the town's prophecies coming true. But Matthew seemed unaware of her internal struggle, or perhaps he was fighting his own. He remained respectful, keeping a careful distance even as their friendship grew closer. They did not speak of the future, living instead in the pleasant present where they were simply 2 people who enjoyed each other's company. November arrived with a cold snap that frosted the desert overnight. Josephine was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard shouting from the direction of town. She went to the window and saw a group of riders approaching, at least a dozen men on horseback. Her stomach clenched with anxiety. Matthew emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. He stood watching the riders approach, his posture relaxed but alert. Josephine hurried outside to stand beside him. The riders stopped at the fence. She recognized most of them. Mr. Harrison from the hotel, the blacksmith, Tom Wheeler, several ranchers from the area, including Mr. Morrison. They all looked grim. "Evening, gentlemen," Matthew said calmly. "Something I can help you with." Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "We've come to talk some sense into you, Morgan. You've been living here for near 2 months now, working for Mrs. Lambert." "Miss Lambert," Matthew corrected. "And I work for Mr. Morrison. I rent barn space from Miss Lambert in exchange for repairs. Nothing improper about that. That's not how it looks to the town." Tom Wheeler shifted in his saddle. "We're trying to help you here. That woman is cursed. 2 husbands dead in less than 3 years. You're tempting fate staying here. I don't believe in curses." Matthew's voice remained even. "And I don't appreciate you riding out here to tell me how to live my life." "We're trying to save your life," Mr. Harrison insisted, "before you become husband number 3. Josephine felt her face burn with humiliation and anger. "I'm not looking for a 3rd husband. Mr. Morgan is a tenant, nothing more. And even if there was something between us, which there is not, it would be none of your concern." "It's the town's concern when we have a danger in our midst," Tom Wheeler said. "We've tolerated you long enough, Mrs. Lambert. Maybe it's time you moved on, took your curse somewhere else. You have no right to run her out of her own home." Matthew's voice had taken on an edge now. "And you sure as hell have no right to threaten her." "We're not threatening," Mr. Morrison spoke up, sounding almost apologetic. "We're just suggesting, for everyone's safety. My safety is my own business." Matthew crossed his arms. "Now I think you gentlemen should ride on back to town before this conversation becomes unpleasant." There was steel in his voice that made several of the riders exchange uncertain glances. Mr. Harrison opened his mouth to argue further, but Mr. Morrison shook his head. "We've said our piece," Morrison said. "What you do with the warning is up to you, Morgan, but don't say we didn't try to help." The group turned their horses and rode back toward town, leaving dust hanging in the air. Josephine realized she was shaking. Matthew's hand touched her elbow gently. "Come on," he said. "Let's go inside." In the kitchen, Josephine gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. "They want me gone. They actually want to drive me out of my own home. They're afraid and ignorant." Matthew poured her a glass of water. "But they won't do anything. They're not brave enough for actual action, just words and posturing. You should go." Josephine looked at him directly. "You should pack your things and leave tonight. Find somewhere else to stay. They're right about one thing. I've lost 2 husbands. Maybe there is something wrong with me. Maybe you are in danger just being here. There's nothing wrong with you except bad luck." Matthew set the glass in front of her. "And I'm not going anywhere unless you want me gone. I don't want you hurt." The words came out more passionate than she intended. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you too." Matthew studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. "Josephine," he said quietly, "are you afraid something will happen to me, or are you afraid of caring about what happens to me?" The question cut through her defenses. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Both, I see." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "Can I tell you something?" She nodded, still not looking at him. "I've been around death," Matthew said. "I've seen men die from bullets, disease, accidents, old age. I've learned that you can't predict it, and you can't prevent it. All you can do is live the life you have as fully as possible. These past 2 months have been some of the best I've known. I enjoy your company, Josephine. I enjoy our conversations, our meals together, working on this property. I feel more at home here than I have anywhere since leaving the cavalry. Matthew." She finally met his eyes, her own filling with tears. "I can't let myself care for you. Everyone I care for dies. Everyone dies eventually." His voice was gentle. "That's the nature of life. But avoiding connection, avoiding feeling, avoiding love because you're afraid of loss, that's not living, Josephine. That's just existing. You don't understand what it's like." A tear spilled down her cheek. "To bury someone you love, to do it twice, to wonder if you're somehow responsible. You're right. I don't know what that's like. Matthew reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. But I know what it's like to be afraid. I know what it's like to let fear make your decisions for you. I did that for a while after leaving the cavalry. Kept everyone at a distance, told myself it was easier that way, but it wasn't easier. It was just lonely. Josephine looked at his hand so close to hers. She could feel the warmth of him across the small distance. What changed? I met a stubborn woman with a reputation for being cursed. A slight smile touched his lips. She fed me breakfast and talked to me like I was a person instead of just hired help. She made me remember that connection is worth the risk. Matthew, she whispered his name like a prayer. I'm not asking for anything, he said. I'm just telling you how I feel. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. But I'm not leaving unless you tell me to go, and I'm not afraid of some imaginary curse. The tears were flowing freely now. Josephine reached across the remaining distance and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and real. I'm terrified, she admitted. I know. He squeezed her hand gently. But you're also brave. You've survived loss twice and kept going. You've faced this town's hatred and held your head high. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Josephine Lambert. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped across the table, something fragile and precious forming between them in the lamplight of the kitchen. Finally, Josephine took a shaky breath. Stay, she said. Please stay. I will. It was a promise. December brought the coldest weather Josephine could remember in Randsburg. Matthew moved from the barn into the spare room in the house, a practical decision given the temperature, but one that sent fresh waves of gossip through town. Josephine found she no longer cared what they said. Let them talk. Let them warn and worry and predict doom. She had spent too long letting their fear dictate her life. Christmas Eve found them sitting by the fireplace, the small house warm and cozy against the cold night outside. Josephine had made a special dinner, using precious ingredients she had been saving. Matthew had brought home a small pine tree he found in the mountains, and they decorated it with strings of dried berries and paper ornaments Josephine cut from old newspapers. I haven't celebrated Christmas properly in years, Josephine said, watching the firelight play across the tree. Thomas died in November, and by the next Christmas I was planning my wedding to Robert. Then he was gone, and last year I was alone. You're not alone this year. Matthew was sitting on the floor near the fire, looking relaxed and content. This is the nicest Christmas I've had since I was a boy. Tell me about your family. Josephine was curled in the armchair, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders. You never talk about them. Matthew was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. My parents had a small farm in Missouri. Good people, hardworking. They died of influenza when I was 16. I didn't have any siblings and there wasn't anyone else, so I joined the cavalry as soon as they'd take me. Seemed like as good a plan as any. I'm sorry. Josephine understood the weight of that kind of loss. It must have been hard being so young and alone. It was. He glanced up at her, the firelight catching in his eyes. But it taught me to be independent, to make my own way. And it led me here eventually, so I can't regret it too much. Josephine felt her heart squeeze. She set aside the quilt and moved to sit on the floor beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Matthew turned to look at her, surprise and something else warming his expression. I got you something, Josephine said, suddenly nervous. For Christmas. It's not much, but I wanted you to have it. She pulled a small wrapped package from behind the chair where she had hidden it earlier. Matthew took it carefully, unwrapping the brown paper to reveal a pair of leather gloves, well made and sturdy. Josephine. He ran his fingers over the leather. These are beautiful. You made these. I used to do leatherwork before I was married. I still had some tools and materials. She watched his face anxiously. I noticed your old gloves were falling apart and winter is hard on hands. They're perfect. He slipped one on, flexing his fingers. Thank you. This is the most thoughtful gift anyone's given me in years. I'm glad you like them. She felt warmth spread through her chest at his obvious pleasure. I have something for you too. Matthew reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. It's not much, but I saw it in town and thought of you. Josephine unwrapped the cloth to find a delicate silver chain with a small pendant. The pendant was a simple design, a flower with 5 petals, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Matthew, this is lovely. She held it up to the firelight, watching it gleam. Help me put it on. He moved behind her, taking the chain and fastening it around her neck with careful fingers. His hands lingered for just a moment on her shoulders, and Josephine felt her breath catch. She turned to face him and found him closer than she expected, their faces mere inches apart. Josephine, he said softly, I need to tell you something. What is it? I'm falling in love with you. The words were simple, direct, honest. I've tried not to. I've told myself it's too soon, that you need more time, that I should be patient. But sitting here with you on Christmas Eve, I can't keep it to myself anymore. I love you. Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes again, but this time they were different. Not tears of grief or fear, but of something achingly hopeful. I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered. And it terrifies me. I know. Matthew lifted his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently cupped her cheek. But I'm not afraid of what the future might bring. I'm only afraid of not taking this chance. Josephine leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them again, she found courage she did not know she possessed. Kiss me. Matthew leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. When his lips finally met hers, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Josephine felt something break open inside her. All the fear and grief and loneliness of the past years cracking apart to make room for this new feeling, this overwhelming rush of love and hope and possibility. They drew apart slowly, foreheads resting together. Matthew's thumb brushed across her cheek, wiping away a tear. I won't leave you, he said. I won't die because of some curse or bad luck or whatever the town thinks. I'm strong and careful, and I plan to live a very long life with you if you'll have me. Yes. The word came out fierce and certain. Yes, I'll have you. They kissed again, longer this time, and when they finally settled back against the hearth, Josephine was tucked against Matthew's side, his arm around her shoulders, both of them watching the fire and the little decorated tree and feeling, for the first time in a long time, truly content. The new year arrived with unexpected challenges. In mid-January, a severe winter storm struck Randsburg, bringing heavy rain and flooding to the desert town. The normally dry washes became raging torrents, and several buildings on the edge of town were damaged. Matthew spent 3 days helping with rescue and repair efforts, coming home exhausted and soaked through. Josephine waited anxiously each time he left, the old fears rising up despite her best efforts to push them down. What if something happened to him during the rescue work? What if the curse found a way despite his confidence and strength? But each evening he returned safely, and slowly her anxiety began to ease. On the 4th day after the storm, when the waters had receded and the damage was being assessed, Mr. Morrison rode out to the house. Josephine met him at the door, expecting more warnings or condemnation. Instead, the rancher looked embarrassed. "Miss Lambert," he said, removing his hat, "I came to apologize. During the storm, my youngest daughter fell into the flood water." She would have drowned if Matthew hadn't jumped in and pulled her out. He risked his life to save her. Josephine's hand flew to her mouth. Matthew never said anything. That's the kind of man he is. Morrison twisted his hat in his hands. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong to come out here with those other men trying to scare Matthew off. My wife wanted me to tell you that we're grateful, and we're sorry for how we've treated you. Thank you for saying that. Josephine's voice was thick with emotion. It means more than you know. After Morrison left, Josephine confronted Matthew as he came in from the barn. Why didn't you tell me about saving that little girl? He shrugged, looking uncomfortable. It wasn't a big thing. Anyone would have done the same. It was a big thing. She crossed her arms, torn between anger and affection. You could have been killed, and you never mentioned it. I didn't want to worry you. He met her eyes. I know you're still afraid something will happen to me. I didn't want to add to that fear. Matthew Morgan. She stepped closer to him. If we're going to do this, if we're going to be together, you can't hide things from me to protect me. I'm stronger than that. You're right. He took her hands. I'm sorry. No more hiding things. No more hiding things, she agreed and pulled him down for a kiss. Word of Matthew's heroism spread through Randsburg faster than the original gossip about the curse. Other people began coming forward with stories. The elderly widow he had helped with firewood. The struggling family he had given money to for supplies. The drunk he had pulled out of the path of a runaway wagon. Matthew had been quietly helping people throughout his time in Randsburg, asking nothing in return, building a reputation through actions rather than words. The town's attitude began to shift. Not all at once and not everyone, but gradually. When Josephine went to the general store, fewer people crossed the street. Some even nodded in greeting. The change was small but significant. In early February, the local minister's wife invited Josephine to join the church's sewing circle. It was an olive branch, an invitation back into the community. Josephine almost refused out of pride, but Matthew encouraged her to go. Give them a chance, he said. People can change when given the opportunity. So Josephine went to the sewing circle, sitting stiffly at first among women who had shunned her for over a year. But as the afternoon progressed and conversation flowed, she found herself relaxing. These women asked about her life, listened to her stories about Thomas and Robert with sympathy rather than suspicion, and several apologized for their previous treatment of her. We were afraid, Mrs. Harrison admitted. It's a hard life out here, and we're all so close to tragedy ourselves. Your losses reminded us of our own vulnerability, and we responded poorly. I'm sorry for that. Josephine accepted the apology with grace, though the wounds were still tender. Forgiveness, she was learning, was a process rather than a single moment. March brought warmer weather and the first wildflowers blooming across the desert. Matthew and Josephine had settled into a comfortable rhythm of life together. Though they maintained separate bedrooms for propriety's sake, they were clearly a couple. They held hands when they walked to town. They attended church together on Sundays. They made plans for the future, talking about expanding the garden, maybe getting some chickens, perhaps even a milk cow. One evening in late March, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Matthew pulled something from his pocket. Josephine recognized it as the small carved box he kept in his room. I want to show you something, he said, opening the box. Inside was a ring, simple gold with a small stone. This was my mother's wedding ring. My father gave it to me before he died, told me to give it to the woman I wanted to spend my life with. Josephine's breath caught. Matthew, I know it hasn't been very long. He took her hand. I know people might say we should wait longer, be more cautious. But I've learned that life is uncertain and time is precious. I love you, Josephine Lambert. I want to marry you, build a life with you, grow old with you. Will you be my wife? the old fear rose up, sharp and immediate. Another husband, another chance for loss, another opportunity for the curse to strike. But beneath the fear was something stronger: love, hope, the absolute certainty that Matthew was worth the risk. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and Josephine felt like she was finally, truly home. The engagement announcement sent ripples through Randsburg. Most people were supportive, happy to see Josephine finding love again. But there were still whispers, still warnings. The curse remained in some minds, a dark shadow that could not be dismissed by simple heroism or community acceptance. Old Mrs. Fletcher, the town's resident doomsayer, stopped Matthew on the street one afternoon. "You're a fool," she told him bluntly. "That woman has buried 2 husbands. You'll be the 3rd. Matthew listened politely, then said, "Mrs. Fletcher, I've survived cavalry patrols in hostile territory, a stampede that killed 2 other cowboys, and falling through ice into a frozen river when I was a boy. If death wants me, it'll have to work a lot harder than some imaginary curse." The story made its way back to Josephine, who laughed despite herself. "You fell through ice into a frozen river." "When I was 12, Matthew confirmed. "Nearly died of cold, but my father pulled me out in time." "My point is, I've had plenty of close calls that had nothing to do with you. Life is dangerous, Josephine. Getting married to you doesn't change that." They decided on a simple wedding in late April, giving them time to prepare but not drawing it out unnecessarily. Josephine had already been through 2 weddings and had no desire for an elaborate affair. Matthew agreed completely. They would marry in the church with a small gathering of friends and well-wishers, then have a simple reception at their house. As the wedding day approached, Josephine found herself surprisingly calm. The fear that had dominated so much of her life had not disappeared entirely, but it no longer controlled her. She had chosen love over fear, chosen to live fully rather than hide from possibility. Whatever the future held, she would face it with Matthew by her side. The night before the wedding, Matthew stayed at the Morrison Ranch to observe tradition. Josephine lay in bed, looking at the ceiling of her soon-to-be former bedroom as a single woman. Tomorrow she would be a wife for the 3rd time. The thought still carried weight, still brought echoes of loss, but it also brought joy. She touched the pendant Matthew had given her at Christmas, now a talisman of sorts. She thought of Thomas and Robert, the men she had loved and lost. She hoped they would understand, would want her to find happiness again. She whispered a quiet goodbye to that part of her life, honoring the past while stepping fully into the future. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the April sky a brilliant blue. Josephine dressed in a simple cream-colored dress, nothing like the elaborate white gown she had worn for her first 2 weddings. This felt more appropriate, more honest. She was not a young bride entering marriage with naive hope. She was a woman who had loved and lost, who understood the fragility of life, and who was choosing love anyway. The church was fuller than she expected. The Morrisons came with their whole family. The sewing circle ladies attended. Various ranchers and townspeople who had come to respect Matthew filled the pews. Even some of Josephine's old friends, who had maintained their distance during the curse years, showed up to support her. When Matthew appeared at the front of the church in his best suit, freshly shaved and looking nervous, Josephine felt her heart swell with love. This good man, who had seen past the town's superstition to the woman beneath, who had chosen to stay when everyone warned him away, who loved her with a steady strength that felt like bedrock beneath her feet. She walked down the aisle alone, needing no one to give her away. She had given herself, freely and completely. and she met Matthew's eyes the entire way, seeing her own love reflected back at her. The minister spoke of love and commitment, of choosing each other day after day, of building a life together through good times and bad. When it came time for the vows, Matthew took both her hands in his. "I, Matthew Morgan, take you, Josephine Lambert, to be my wife," he said clearly. "I promise to stand beside you, to support you, to love you through whatever life brings. I'm not afraid of curses or bad luck or the future. I'm only committed to you now and always." Josephine's voice was strong and clear as she replied, "I, Josephine Lambert, take you, Matthew Morgan, to be my husband. I promise to trust you, to build a life with you, to choose love over fear every single day. You've shown me that it's possible to live fully even after loss, and I'm grateful for that gift. I love you now and always." The minister pronounced them married, and when Matthew kissed her, the church erupted in applause. Josephine laughed against his lips, feeling joy bubble up inside her like a spring. The reception at their house was lively and warm. Someone brought a fiddle, and there was dancing in the yard. Food appeared in abundance, brought by various guests. The Morrisons gave them a beautiful quilt. The sewing circle presented them with embroidered pillowcases. Even old Mrs. Fletcher, the doomsayer, grudgingly gave them a set of preserving jars. As evening approached and guests began to depart, Josephine and Matthew stood together at the fence, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and rose. "How are you feeling?" Matthew asked quietly. "Happy." Josephine leaned into his side. "Genuinely, completely happy. And a little surprised by that. Surprised by happiness, surprised that I'm not more afraid." She looked up at him. "I thought I would be terrified all day, waiting for something to go wrong, but I wasn't. I'm not. I just feel certain that this is right, that we're right. We are right." Matthew kissed the top of her head. "And we're going to have a long, happy life together. I'm certain of that too." The first months of marriage were an adjustment, but a welcome one. They moved into the same bedroom, combining their lives fully. Matthew continued working at the Morrison Ranch while also taking on other jobs around the area. His reputation as a hard worker and good man brought steady employment. Josephine expanded the garden, started keeping chickens, and took in some sewing work to contribute to their income. Summer arrived with intense heat that baked the desert. One particularly hot day in July, Matthew came home early from the Morrison Ranch, looking pale and shaky. Josephine's heart nearly stopped. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "Just heat exhaustion," Matthew assured her, though he had to sit down heavily. "Mr. Morrison sent me home to rest. I'll be fine." Josephine's hands shook as she brought him water, helped him out of his boots, put a cool cloth on his forehead. All the old fears came rushing back. This was how it started. This was the curse taking hold. Matthew caught her hand, stopping her frantic ministrations. "Josephine, look at me. I'm fine. It's just heat exhaustion. Half the crew is dealing with it. I need water and rest, that's all." "You're sure?" Her voice was small. "I'm sure." He pulled her down to sit beside him. "And even if I wasn't, even if this was something serious, panicking won't help. Trust me. Trust that I'm strong enough to handle whatever comes." She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to calm down. "You're right. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just breathe." He kept hold of her hand. "I know the fear doesn't just disappear, but we'll get through it together, okay?" He was fine by the next morning, back to his usual strength. But the incident reminded Josephine that healing from trauma was not linear. She would have setbacks, moments when the old fears gripped her hard. The key was not letting them control her, not letting them steal the joy she had found. As summer progressed, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. The realization brought a complex mix of emotions. Joy at the thought of having Matthew's child, fear that something would go wrong, hope for the future, anxiety about all the things that could happen. She told Matthew one evening in August as they sat on the porch in the relative cool of twilight, "I'm going to have a baby." Matthew's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, joy, wonder, and then concern as he looked at her carefully. "How do you feel about it?" "I don't know," Josephine admitted. "I'm happy and terrified and excited and worried, all at the same time." "That seems like a reasonable response to finding out you're going to be a mother." Matthew took her hand. "We'll figure it out together. Whatever you need, whatever you're feeling, we'll handle it." "What if something goes wrong?" the fear spilled out. "What if the curse, or the bad luck, or whatever it is, affects the baby?" "Then we'll deal with it." Matthew's voice was steady. "But Josephine, thousands of women have healthy babies every year. There's no reason to think you won't be one of them. Try not to borrow trouble from a future that hasn't happened yet." It was good advice, though difficult to follow. As the pregnancy progressed, Josephine tried to focus on the present rather than worrying about all the potential disasters. The women from the sewing circle rallied around her, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Mrs. Morrison, who had 7 children of her own, became an unexpected source of support and wisdom. Matthew was attentive and protective without being overbearing. He took on more of the heavy work around the house, insisted Josephine rest when she was tired, and seemed genuinely excited about becoming a father. In late October, on a cool, clear day, Josephine went into labor. The local midwife, Mrs. Chen, attended along with Mrs. Morrison and 2 other experienced mothers from town. Matthew paced outside, following the tradition of keeping fathers out of the birthing room. The labor was long and difficult. As the hours stretched on and Josephine's pain increased, she heard the old whispers in her mind. The curse. Bad luck. Something would go wrong. It always did. But Mrs. Chen was experienced and calm, guiding Josephine through each contraction with steady confidence. Mrs. Morrison held her hand and told her she was doing well. The other women provided encouragement and practical help. And gradually, painfully, the baby made its way into the world. The first cry was the most beautiful sound Josephine had ever heard. Mrs. Chen cleaned the baby quickly and placed the bundle in Josephine's arms. "You have a son," she announced with a smile. Josephine looked down at the tiny red face, the small fists waving, the eyes squinting against the light. Her son. Hers and Matthew's, perfect and healthy and alive. "Can you bring Matthew in?" she asked, unable to take her eyes off the baby. Matthew came in looking terrified and hopeful. When he saw Josephine holding the baby alive and well, his face crumpled with relief. He came to the bedside, looking down at his son with wonder. "He's perfect," Matthew whispered. "He is." Josephine felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "We did it. We made a healthy, perfect baby." They named him Thomas Robert Morgan, honoring both of Josephine's first husbands. It felt right to carry those names forward, to acknowledge the past while embracing the future. The weeks after Thomas's birth were exhausting and wonderful. Josephine had never been so tired in her life, but she had also never felt so complete. Matthew was a natural father, comfortable holding the baby, walking with him at night when he fussed, changing diapers without complaint. The town celebrated the birth as if little Thomas belonged to everyone. Gifts appeared on their doorstep. The church ladies organized meals to help the new family. Even old Mrs. Fletcher came by with a hand-knitted blanket. "I was wrong about the curse," the old woman said gruffly, looking at the baby sleeping in Josephine's arms. "Or maybe love broke it. Either way, I'm glad for you." It was as close to an apology as Mrs. Fletcher could manage, and Josephine accepted it with grace. As winter approached again, marking a full year since Matthew had first arrived at Josephine's door, They sat together by the fireplace with baby Thomas sleeping between them in a cradle Matthew had built. "You remember when I first asked to rent your barn?" Matthew asked, staring into the fire. "I remember thinking you were either very brave or very foolish to want anything to do with me." Josephine smiled at the memory. "The whole town had made me out to be some kind of monster. You were never a monster, just unlucky." Matthew reached over the cradle to take her hand. "Though I'm starting to think maybe your bad luck ran out, because finding you, loving you, building this life together feels like the best luck I've ever had." "I think you're right." Josephine squeezed his hand. "I spent so long being afraid, letting the fear control everything. Thank you for showing me a different way." We showed each other. Matthew's thumb traced circles on her palm. "You taught me about resilience, about facing grief and coming out the other side. You made me want to put down roots, build a real home." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their son sleep, feeling the warmth of the fire and each other's presence. The house that had once felt like a lonely prison had become a sanctuary. The town that had shunned Josephine now embraced her family. The curse that had defined her for so long had been broken, not by magic or chance, but by the simple act of choosing love over fear. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Ranching and farming in the Mojave Desert was always difficult. There were droughts and floods, good years and bad years. Matthew had a close call with a rattlesnake in 1899 that required a tense few days of recovery, during which Josephine discovered that her fear, while still present, no longer paralyzed her. She could be afraid and still function, still care for him and their son, still trust that things would work out. In 1900, their second child was born, a daughter they named Grace Margaret. She had Josephine's dark hair and Matthew's gray eyes, and from the moment she entered the world, she was fierce and determined. Thomas, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister. As the new century dawned, Randsburg continued to grow and change. The mining operations that had built the town began to decline, but other industries took their place. The Morrison Ranch expanded, and Matthew became the foreman, a position of respect and good pay. Josephine's sewing work evolved into a small business, making and selling clothes throughout the region. They added onto the house, building more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The garden flourished under Josephine's care, providing vegetables for the family and surplus to sell. The chickens multiplied, and they did eventually get that milk cow Matthew had talked about. In 1903, their third child was born, another son they named Samuel James. The house was full of noise and laughter, the sounds of children playing, the daily rhythms of family life. Josephine sometimes marveled at how different her life had become from those dark days after Robert's death, when she had been alone and shunned, believing herself cursed and unworthy of love. One evening in the spring of 1904, after the children were in bed, Josephine and Matthew took a walk in the desert. The wildflowers were blooming, carpeting the ground in yellow and purple. The air was soft and sweet, and the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Do you ever think about the curse anymore?" Matthew asked. Josephine considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Usually when I'm afraid something bad might happen. The old patterns of thought are still there even after all these years, but I don't believe in it anymore. I lost Thomas and Robert, and that was tragic and painful, but it wasn't because of anything I did or didn't do. It was just life being unpredictable and sometimes cruel. And now," Matthew stopped walking, turning to face her in the fading light. "Now I have you and our children and a life I never thought I'd get to live." Josephine smiled up at him. "Now I understand that love is always a risk, but it's a risk worth taking, every single time." Matthew pulled her close, kissing her softly. "I love you, Josephine Morgan. I love you too." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you for being brave enough to see past the gossip and the fear. Thank you for choosing me. Always," Matthew murmured into her hair. "Always." They stood together as the stars emerged fully, the desert stretching out around them in its stark beauty. In the house behind them, their children slept safely. In the town beyond, they had friends and community. And in each other, they had found a love strong enough to overcome fear, to break curses both real and imagined, to build a future neither of them had dared to hope for. The story that Randsburg told about Josephine Lambert changed over the years. She was no longer the cursed widow who brought death to her husbands. Instead, she became known as the woman who had survived tragedy with grace, who had found love again despite all odds, who had built a beautiful family with the brave cowboy who refused to believe in curses. Young couples in town would sometimes come to Josephine and Matthew for advice, seeing in their marriage a model of strength and commitment. Josephine would tell them about choosing love over fear, about the importance of trust and communication, about giving each other space to be afraid while also being brave together. As the children grew, Josephine made sure they knew the story of their family. She told them about Thomas and Robert, the good men who had died too young, whose names lived on in their first son. She told them about how their father had arrived in Randsburg when no one else would even speak to her, how he had seen her worth when the rest of the town saw only superstition and fear. Thomas, as he grew into boyhood, showed his father's calm strength and practical nature. He loved working with the animals and helping Matthew around the property. Grace was fierce and independent, already declaring at age 4 that she was going to be a rancher when she grew up, just like her father. Samuel was still too young to show much personality beyond being generally cheerful and curious about everything. In 1906, when Josephine was pregnant with their 4th child, old Mrs. Fletcher finally passed away at the age of 87. At the funeral, people remembered her as the town's doomsayer, the woman who had predicted gloom and doom for decades. But they also remembered how she had eventually admitted she was wrong about Josephine's curse, how she had made that blanket for baby Thomas, how she had softened in her final years. "Even the most stubborn hearts can change," Josephine said to Matthew as they walked home from the funeral. She spent most of her life afraid of everything, warning everyone, seeing danger everywhere. But in the end, she let herself be proven wrong. That takes courage in its own way. Their 4th child, another daughter, was born in the autumn of 1906. They named her Rose Elizabeth, and she completed their family in a way that felt perfect and right. 4 healthy children, a thriving home, a marriage built on mutual respect and deep love. The years continued their steady march forward. Matthew's hair began to show threads of silver at the temples. Josephine developed fine lines around her eyes from years of squinting in the desert sun and smiling at her children. They grew older together, facing the challenges of raising a family, managing their property, and being active members of their community. In 1910, when Thomas was 12 and already showing promise as a horseman, he asked his mother about the curse. The other children had been fed a sanitized version of the story, but Thomas was old enough now to hear the full truth. They sat together on the porch, just the two of them, and Josephine told him everything. The deaths of his namesakes, the town's reaction, the isolation and fear, and then Matthew's arrival and everything that came after. "Were you really cursed?" Thomas asked seriously. "No," Josephine said firmly. "I was unlucky. There's a difference. A curse implies intention, some kind of supernatural force targeting you specifically, What I had was just bad luck combined with the human tendency to find patterns where there are none. How did you get past the fear? Thomas looked at her with his father's steady gray eyes. How did you let yourself love Dad when you were so afraid he would die too? It was a perceptive question from a 12-year-old. Josephine took a moment to formulate her answer. I didn't get past it all at once, she said finally. It was a series of small choices. Your father made me feel safe enough to take those risks. He was patient with my fear, but he also challenged me not to let it control my life. And eventually, I realized that living in fear wasn't really living at all. Better to love fully and risk loss than to hide away and never feel anything. That makes sense. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I'm glad you were brave enough to marry Dad, otherwise we wouldn't exist. I'm glad too. Josephine hugged her son. You and your siblings are the best things that ever happened to me. As the children moved into their teenage years, the house remained lively and full. Thomas became his father's right hand at the ranch, learning everything Matthew could teach him about horses and cattle and the land. Grace, true to her childhood declaration, showed aptitude for ranch work that rivaled her older brothers, though her interests also extended to mechanics and anything involving taking things apart to see how they worked. Samuel developed a love of books and learning that neither parent had quite expected. By the time he was 10, he had read everything in the small Randsburg library and was begging for more. Matthew and Josephine scraped together money to buy him books whenever possible, encouraging his academic interests, even though they had no idea where they might lead. Rose, the youngest, showed artistic talent from an early age. She drew everything she saw, capturing the desert landscape, her family, the animals, the townspeople, all with a detail and sensitivity that suggested real skill. We made interesting children, Matthew observed one evening in 1915, watching Thomas work with a difficult horse while Grace repaired a wagon wheel. Samuel read under a tree and Rose sketched it all. We did. Josephine smiled with pride. 4 completely different people, all finding their own paths. You think they'll stay in Randsburg, Matthew wondered, or will they want to see more of the world? I don't know. Josephine leaned against his shoulder, but whatever they choose, they'll know they're loved and supported. That's what matters. The Great War came and went, touching Randsburg primarily through newspapers and the occasional young man who enlisted and didn't come home. The Morgans were fortunate. Thomas was too young in the early years, and by the time he was old enough, the war was ending. Matthew, at 44 when America entered the war, was too old for conscription. The 1920s brought changes to Randsburg and the surrounding area. The automobile became more common, replacing horses for many purposes. Radio began to appear in homes, bringing news and entertainment from faraway places. The world was modernizing, though the desert town retained much of its frontier character. In 1922, Thomas married a young woman named Alina from a neighboring ranch. It was a beautiful wedding, and Josephine watched her eldest son pledge his love with tears in her eyes, remembering her own weddings, all of them, and feeling grateful that Thomas had found someone who made him happy. Grace, at 22, showed no interest in marriage, declaring she was too busy learning to fly airplanes, a new passion that terrified Josephine but which Matthew supported with his characteristic calm acceptance of their children's choices. Samuel left for university in Los Angeles, the first Morgan to pursue higher education, planning to become a teacher. Rose, at 16, was already selling her artwork and talking about going to art school in San Francisco. As Josephine approached her 50th birthday in 1923, she reflected on the arc of her life, the tragedy and fear of her youth, the isolation and grief. And then Matthew, changing everything, showing her that love was possible even after loss, that curses could be broken, that choosing courage over fear could transform an entire life. She had been married to Matthew for 25 years now, longer than both her previous marriages combined. They had built a strong family, contributed to their community, and loved each other through good times and bad. The curse that had once defined her was now just a story she sometimes told, a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting fear and superstition override compassion and reason. One afternoon in late spring, as Josephine tended her garden and Matthew worked on repairing the fence, they heard a commotion from the road. A young woman was riding hard toward their house, clearly distressed. As she got closer, Josephine recognized her as Mary Sullivan, the daughter of one of the newer families in town. Mary practically fell off her horse, gasping for breath. "Please, Mrs. Morgan, you have to help. My sister Jenny, she just got married last month and now her husband had an accident at the mine. He's going to be all right, but Jenny is hysterical. She keeps saying she's cursed, that she's going to lose him like I lost my first 2 husbands," Josephine finished quietly. She wiped the dirt from her hands. "Take me to her." Matthew appeared at her side. "Want me to come?" "No, this is something I need to do alone." She kissed his cheek. "I'll be back for dinner." She rode with Mary to the Sullivan house, where Jenny sat in her bedroom, pale and shaking, eyes red from crying. The girl was only 19, married just a few weeks and clearly terrified. "He's going to die," Jenny whispered as Josephine sat beside her. "It's happening already. First the accident and next." "Next, probably nothing," Josephine said firmly. "Jenny, listen to me. I know you've heard the stories about me, how I buried 2 husbands young, how the town called me cursed." "Yes." Jenny looked at her with desperate eyes. "And now it's happening to me. I'm cursed too." "No." Josephine took the girl's hands. "You're scared and that's understandable, but your husband had an accident. Men have accidents at the mines all the time. It doesn't mean you're cursed. It means mining is dangerous work. But what if he dies? What if something else happens? Then you'll grieve and eventually you'll heal, because that's what humans do." Josephine's voice was gentle but firm. "But you can't live your whole life waiting for tragedy to strike. You can't let fear of what might happen steal the joy of what is happening. I wasted too much time doing exactly that, and I'm telling you now, don't make the same mistake." "How did you get past it?" Jenny asked, echoing the question her own son had asked years before. "How did you marry Mr. Morgan when you were so afraid?" "He didn't let me hide." Josephine smiled at the memory. "He saw through my fear to the person underneath. He chose to love me despite the risk, and that courage gave me courage. You have to trust your husband, trust yourself, and trust that whatever happens, you're strong enough to handle it." They talked for over an hour, Josephine sharing her story in detail, holding nothing back. The fear, the grief, the isolation, and then the slow healing that came with Matthew's love and patience. By the time Josephine left, Jenny was calmer, her hysteria replaced by a tentative hope. "Thank you," the girl said at the door. "I don't think anyone else could have understood like you do." Riding home in the golden light of late afternoon, Josephine thought about how strange life was. The curse that had once been her burden, the tragedy that had isolated her, had now become a source of wisdom she could share with others. Her pain had been transformed into something useful, something that could help other frightened young women navigate their own fears. Matthew was waiting on the porch when she arrived. "How is she?" "Better." Josephine dismounted and led her horse to the barn, Matthew walking alongside her. "Scared, but that's natural. I told her my story. I think it helped her understand that fear is normal, but it doesn't have to control you." "You're good at that." Matthew took the horse's reins. "Helping people. You always have been, even when the town wouldn't let you. Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this." Josephine leaned against the barn door, watching her husband tend to the horse with practiced ease. "The curse everyone saw in me wasn't real, but the strength I developed from surviving those losses, from facing that fear, that is real, and it's something I can offer to others. Sounds like you turned tragedy into purpose." Matthew came over and pulled her into his arms. "I'm proud of you, Josephine Morgan. I couldn't have done any of it without you." She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him. After 25 years, he still made her feel safe. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Matthew corrected. "I was drifting before I met you. You gave me a reason to stop running, to build something permanent." They stood together in the barn doorway, the desert sunset painting everything in shades of gold and rose, much like that evening 25 years ago when they had watched the sunset after their wedding. So much had changed since then. They had built a life, raised children, weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. And through it all, their love had remained constant. The late 1920s brought more changes. Thomas and Alina had their first child, making Josephine and Matthew grandparents. Grace finally met someone who matched her independent spirit, a fellow pilot named Jack, and surprised everyone by getting married in a small ceremony in 1927. Samuel graduated from university and took a teaching position in Los Angeles, though he visited Randsburg regularly. Rose attended art school in San Francisco and began making a name for herself in the California art scene. As 1929 turned into 1930, Josephine was 56 and Matthew was 59. They had slowed down somewhat, handing off more of the ranch work to Thomas and hiring additional help when needed. But they were still healthy, still active, still deeply in love. One morning in early spring, Josephine woke to find Matthew watching her, his head propped on his hand. "What are you thinking?" she asked, smiling. "That I've loved you for 30 years. His voice was soft. "That seems like something worth celebrating. 30 years since you arrived at my door asking to rent my barn." Josephine reached up to touch his face, now lined with age but still handsome to her eyes. "Best decision I ever made, saying yes. Best decision I ever made, asking." Matthew kissed her palm. "Want to know a secret? Always. When I rode into Randsburg that day, I was planning to stay maybe a week, just long enough to earn some money and move on. I had been running for so long, never staying anywhere for more than a few months. But then I met you and everything changed. You never told me that." Josephine studied his face. "You always seemed so certain, so sure of yourself." "I was certain about you," Matthew clarified. "That first day when you stood in your doorway and told me straight out that the town thought you were cursed, I saw how brave you were, how you faced their hatred and kept going. I knew right then that you were someone special. I didn't feel brave. I felt broken and alone. You were hurting." "That's different from broken." Matthew pulled her closer. "And you were never really alone, even before I came along. You had yourself, your strength, your resilience. I just helped you remember that." They lay together in the soft morning light, holding each other, marveling at the life they had built. 30 years. 4 children. 2 grandchildren now, with a third on the way. A home filled with love and laughter. A community that had learned to see past their fear and accept Josephine back into the fold. "You ever regret it?" Josephine asked suddenly. "Staying with me despite the warnings. Your life might have been easier if you had listened to them." "Easier doesn't mean better." Matthew was firm. "My life with you has been rich and full and meaningful. That's worth more than easy." As spring progressed into summer, Josephine found herself thinking more and more about the past, about Thomas and Robert, the young men she had loved and lost so many years ago. She had not forgotten them, had never forgotten them, but time had softened the grief into something gentler. She could remember them now with fondness rather than pain, grateful for the time she had with them while also being deeply grateful for the life she had with Matthew. One afternoon, she visited the cemetery where both men were buried. She had not been there in years, having made her peace with their deaths long ago. But something drew her back now, perhaps a need to close one final circle. She stood before their graves, reading the familiar names and dates. Thomas Lambert, 1873–1895. Robert Lambert, 1874–1896. Both so young, both gone too soon. "I wanted you to know that I'm happy," she said softly, speaking to the stones. "I found love again, built a beautiful family. I hope you'd be glad for me. I think you would be. You were both good men who wanted good things for me." The wind whispered through the cemetery, carrying the scent of desert sage. Josephine felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had carried guilt for so long, wondering if loving Matthew somehow betrayed her first husband's. But standing here now, she understood that love did not diminish love. Her capacity to care for Thomas and Robert had not been reduced by her love for Matthew. If anything, surviving those losses had made her appreciate her current blessings even more. "Thank you," she whispered to the graves, "for the time we had, for teaching me about love, even though it was brief. I'll carry the good memories of you always." She left the cemetery feeling lighter, as if she had finally set down a burden she had been carrying for decades. When she arrived home, Matthew was on the porch and she went straight to him, wrapping her arms around him tight. "I love you," she said fiercely. "I love you so much. I love you too." Matthew held her close, not questioning the sudden declaration. "Always have, always will." As summer gave way to autumn, the Morgan family gathered for Josephine's 57th birthday. All 4 children came home with their families. Thomas and Alina brought their 3 children. Grace and Jack flew in from their home near San Diego, where they ran a small aviation business. Samuel came from Los Angeles with his fiancée, a fellow teacher named Ruth. And Rose arrived from San Francisco, full of stories about the art world and her growing success. The house was full to bursting with people and noise and laughter. Josephine looked around the dinner table, seeing her children grown and happy, seeing her grandchildren playing together, seeing Matthew at the head of the table smiling at her with those steady gray eyes that had seen through her fear all those years ago. "I want to make a toast," Matthew said, standing and raising his glass. Everyone quieted, looking at him expectantly. "To Josephine, the strongest woman I've ever known. The town called her cursed once, but they were wrong. She's blessed. We're all blessed to have her in our lives. To Josephine." Everyone raised their glasses, and Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. "I have something to say, too." She stood, taking Matthew's hand for strength. "I've been thinking a lot lately about the path my life has taken, about loss and fear and love. I was so young when I lost Thomas and Robert. At the time, I thought my life was over. The town's reaction only reinforced that feeling. But then this stubborn cowboy showed up at my door, refusing to believe in curses, insisting on seeing me as a person rather than a symbol of bad luck." She looked at Matthew, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life, Matthew Morgan. Not dramatically, not all at once, but day by day, choice by choice, you showed me that it was possible to live again, to love again. And because of that, I got to have this." She gestured at the full table, the family gathered around. "I got to be a mother, a grandmother, a wife to a good man. I got to transform tragedy into something beautiful. So thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to prove them wrong." There was not a dry eye in the house. Matthew pulled her into his arms, and their children and grandchildren gathered around, a multi-generational embrace that spoke of love and family, and the enduring power of choosing hope over fear. The years continued, bringing both joys and sorrows as they always do. Matthew's health began to decline in his early 60s, arthritis making the ranch work harder. He eventually retired fully, handing the operation over to Thomas. Josephine developed her own aches and pains, the inevitable toll of aging. But they faced it together, supporting each other through the challenges. They took walks when the weather was nice, moving slower than they once had, but still enjoying the desert landscape they had called home for so many decades. They sat on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset, talking about their grandchildren and their memories and the life they had shared. In 1935, Randsburg held a celebration for the town's 40th anniversary. As part of the festivities, they recognized longtime residents who had helped build the community. Josephine and Matthew were among those honored, standing on a platform as the mayor spoke about their contributions. "The Morgans have been pillars of this community for nearly 40 years," the mayor said. "They've shown us what commitment looks like, what love looks like, what it means to overcome adversity with grace and strength." Josephine Morgan, who some of our older residents may remember was once shunned by this very town, has become one of our most respected citizens. Her strength in the face of tragedy, her willingness to forgive those who wronged her, and her dedication to helping other young women facing fear and loss has touched countless lives. Josephine stood with Matthew beside her, overwhelmed by the recognition. The town that had once called her cursed was now celebrating her. It was a remarkable transformation, made possible by time and patience and the steady love of a good man. After the ceremony, old Mrs. Morrison approached them. She was in her 80s now, moving slowly but still sharp as ever. "I wanted to apologize," she said to Josephine. "I was one of the worst gossips when you first lost your husbands. I said terrible things, believed terrible things. I'm sorry for that. Thank you for saying so." Josephine embraced the old woman, but that was a lifetime ago. "We're different people now." "We are," Mrs. Morrison smiled. "And you've turned out to be exactly the kind of woman this town needs. Strong, forgiving, wise. I'm proud to know you." As the 1930s drew to a close and a new decade began, Josephine and Matthew settled into the comfortable rhythm of their later years. Their children visited regularly, bringing grandchildren who filled the house with energy. Grace and Jack had 2 children now, both showing their mother's independent streak. Samuel and Ruth had married and settled in Los Angeles with 2 children of their own. Rose remained unmarried, dedicated to her art, though she visited Randsburg frequently and had become close with her nieces and nephews. Thomas and Alina's children were growing into young adults, the oldest already talking about college. The family was expanding, growing, becoming a network of love and connection that stretched across California. On a quiet evening in the spring of 1940, Josephine and Matthew sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. They were both 67 now, their hair silver, their faces lined, but their love as strong as ever. "You remember when we first sat here together?" Matthew asked. "Must have been 42 years ago now." "I remember." Josephine leaned her head on his shoulder. "I was terrified of feeling anything for you, terrified the curse would strike again. And I was determined to prove that curses weren't real." Matthew chuckled. "Stubborn, both of us, still stubborn." Josephine smiled. "But also still here, still together, still in love after all these years." "Best 42 years of my life." Matthew kissed the top of her head. "I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." They sat in silence as the sun set, painting the desert in familiar shades of gold and purple. Somewhere in the house, the radio played soft music. In the barn, their newest grandchild's pony whinnied softly. Life continued its eternal rhythm, seasons turning, years passing, but some things remaining constant. "I'm not afraid anymore," Josephine said suddenly. "Of death, of loss, of the future. Whatever time we have left, however long or short, I'm not afraid." "Good." Matthew squeezed her hand. "Fear is no way to spend the time we're given." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Josephine reflected on the incredible journey her life had been. From the frightened, grieving young widow the town had called cursed, to the matriarch of a large and loving family. From isolation and fear to connection and courage. All because one brave cowboy had looked past the gossip and seen her worth. All because she had found the courage to say yes to love one more time. The curse had never been real, she understood that now. What had been real was the pain, the grief, the fear. But also real was the love, the healing, the strength she had discovered within herself. And most real of all was the life she had built with Matthew. A life that had proven everyone wrong, that had transformed tragedy into triumph, that had shown a whole town that curses could be broken by the simple act of choosing love over fear. As they rose to go inside for the night, Matthew supporting her as her arthritis made standing difficult, Josephine looked back at the desert one more time. This harsh, beautiful land had been her home for over 40 years. It had witnessed her greatest sorrows and her deepest joys. And it would continue long after she and Matthew were gone, eternal and unchanging. But the love they had built, the family they had created, the lessons they had learned and passed down, those would continue too. Through their children and grandchildren, through the people Josephine had helped over the years, through the example they had set for an entire town. That legacy would endure. Proof that love was stronger than fear, that courage was stronger than curse, and that choosing hope, even after devastating loss, was always worth it. They walked into their house together, hand in hand as they had been for 42 years, ready to face whatever the future held together.